Welcome back, everyone. We're now having our panel session just to discuss our three different infrastructures for the future. There we've talked about three very different approaches to infrastructure for the future. We have Kubernetes, PaaS, and serverless. And it should be noted that no one approach is more valid than either of the other two, because each approach brings its own strengths and advantages to the table, and what's right for you and your organization may not be the best fit for someone else. Now, often when I find myself talking about the future of infrastructure, I get engaged by people who say, well, this is all well and good, but that wouldn't work in my organization. We use virtual machines, and things aren't going to change, and we're dependent upon virtual machines, and we can't migrate. Now, I'm quite cynical, and I don't believe that's necessarily true. I think with any sort of architectural shift, whether you're moving from old virtual machines to new virtual machines or virtual machines to one of these three approaches, there is a migration plan that is involved. And with moving from old VMs to new VMs, that's migration plan's fairly well understood. It's a standard lift and shift. It's very easy. Whereas getting to one of these three architectures, there is more of a learning curve. There is a higher degree of risk. And if you're particularly risk averse, you may pass these three by and play it safe with virtual machines. Which I think is a bit of a shame, because if you get your migration plan correct, then it could be the last migration that you ever need to make. End of a life will never be a thing. You just keep on trucking on. With that in mind, and talking about migrating legacy code bases to the cloud, Melanie, I wanted to start just on Kubernetes. A lot of people engage and tell me that if I want to migrate code to the cloud, the most easy, straightforward way to do that is to use Kubernetes. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, that is a really great question. I know a lot of customers are trying to migrate their code to the cloud, so they think of virtual machines. But actually, we have a better solution, which is container. We have also a lot of customers already tried that solution, like on-prem Docker, and doing everything. It's like a straightforward, lift and shift to containers. But when it comes to cloud, we have a lot of options in different cloud providers to deploy your containers. And Kubernetes actually is on top of containers. It gives us, a real flexibility and more agility to manage thousands of containers, which is a really good solution. So for some existing workloads, which works on virtual machines, quite straightforward. You can build in containers with Docker file, and then you can deploy in the cloud. Either you choose to, for example, use different cloud providers that have Kubernetes solutions, which is managed, or you can even use vanilla Kubernetes from upstream community. It's quite straightforward.
Okay, thank you. Just leading on from that, Darrell, there was a question in for you about whenever Kainos decided to go with AKS at a time when it was just a maturing technology, there must have been a significant risk for such a critical application. So the question is, and leading on from Melanie, who's talking about how it's actually quite straightforward, what was the degree of risk in which Kainos had in deploying to Kubernetes, or were we confident in how it would all pan out?
Sure. So, and thanks, Ian. I think it was that put the question in. It's great to see the engagement. So for the risk for us, it was really, the key for us was the financial incentive that AKS provided at the time. So our only alternative in order to achieve the same sort of security and scaling requirements that we had might have been to build on a more typical sort of virtual machine architecture. And with that, you have both the investment of having to then roll your own mechanisms for scaling and that initial overhead of having to invest in those things, which AKS does for you. So that sort of financial incentive meant that the risk was at least worth looking further into. For us, the biggest key that de-risked using what was at the time a private preview service was the investment from Microsoft and the engagement from Microsoft. So like I mentioned in our talk, we worked very closely with Microsoft to align the dates that this would go generally available specifically for us. But more than just that, we had really senior investment and engagement from technical specialists and direct access into product groups that helped us work through issues that we came up with that you'd expect of a new teething sort of service. And as we found issues, they helped find workarounds and then helped implement permanent fixes. And it was that direct engagement from Microsoft that really de-risked the whole thing of, yes, we're invested in this, but Microsoft are also invested in us succeeding, which helped with that risk. The final thing was really the enthusiasm of the team. So again, I mentioned in the talk that this was the first time that we'd really used Kubernetes and Anger and AKS. But the team that we had on the ground from Kainos were just so enthusiastic about getting from being sort of noobs with this technology to being subject matter experts and sort of upskilling and getting Kubernetes certifications and all that good stuff, which again just de-risked it by becoming experts very quickly.
Okay, yeah. So, Roger, one question I wanted to ask you is that where Kubernetes is seen to, Melanie's talking about how easy it is to wrap code up and deploy it in containers. In my own personal experience, moving an application to PaaS requires a degree of software rewrite. So this could be simple things, like if an application is writing to disk storage, we're going to change it to write to cloud storage, or we're going to, you might need to assess is your database compatible with managed service offerings, say. Well, you mentioned quite a bit there about also re-engineering components to work with APIs. Would you want to elaborate any further on the work that takes to get an application from VMs to pure PaaS?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it depends on what your starting point is and how monolithic your application is. If it has multiple tiers to it or multiple components to it, often that can make it easier to break it down. But you have to look at it by business functionality, what all the different elements do, and whether there's a comparable platform for that in PaaS. And if so, what is that structure? And can you move the database without impacting the rest of the application? So it's really about understanding your existing architecture, how those two elements talk to each other. If it's all in one vendor's platform, then obviously that's more difficult to do. But if it's a custom application you've written on top of a data platform, it's understanding how do those layers talk to each other. Are there ways in which I can move it either one at a time, or can I take them all together? And can I abstract away from that database layer by putting either my own API in or using another API layer to allow me then to move at my own pace to PaaS? So you could move the database to PaaS, and you could keep your existing solution on-premise, or you could move your user interface to PaaS and then keep your database on-premise. It's all about understanding what your starting point is, how it's been architected, and not necessarily looking to move it all in one go, but try to move it piece by piece by either by re-architecting it and putting in web services or microservices and making it more loosely coupled as you can make it, the easier it is to move to PaaS. The more you abstract it and make it generic, the easier it is to switch if you find you want to upgrade to another alternative.
Yeah. Sorry, Darrell, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Do you mind if I just add to that around sort of where Kubernetes fits into that migrating legacy applications, and one key thing that I sort of see with it? So a lot of sort of institutions that you work with that are maybe more apprehensive about moving workloads to the cloud, one of the key things that they often say is, or often restricts them, is the feel of losing control and relinquishing some of your control into native PaaS services might mean that you're operating on shared compute resources, and the physical hardware that you're residing on will be shared across other applications, and that obviously brings in some risk around sort of the surface area that you're exposed to. Kubernetes and services like AKS sort of help provide a middle ground to that. So you're working on PaaS, you're working on the cloud, but you still maintain that control of, because at the end of the day, AKS is just provisioned VMs in the background, right? It's VMs you don't have to care about, but they are there, and they're deployed in a private network, and you have your own VNet and all that good stuff. So it provides that sort of nice halfway house of all the goodness of PaaS, but remaining in control.
Yeah, it's that.
Yeah, and what we've seen also is that customers will use Kubernetes as well as PaaS. And they'll use Kubernetes as a transitional phase to allow them to move that legacy database or that legacy platform into cloud. and allow them to transform away from that over time when they manage to mitigate the other risks that they need to face. So typically, say with old Oracle databases or old versions of code or solutions that are deemed high risk, Kubernetes can be used to insulate that risk and then move to some other things to other PaaS platforms as well.
Absolutely. And sorry, the final point that I want to make there is just around having awareness of, like, Kubernetes is fantastic, but it's not this silver bullet of, okay, I'll containerize my applications, I'll just throw them at Kubernetes. There is an extra layer of knowledge that you have to have. You need to know how your application maps onto a Kubernetes architecture. And that's things like Kubernetes-specific ingress resources, what deployments, services, config maps, all this stuff that is specific to Kubernetes. So it isn't just as simple as, okay, we'll throw that to Kubernetes and it'll work. You do need to understand that, even on PaaS solutions, as good as AKS is.
Darryl, I can see that Melanie is nodding continuously and is very, very keen to make a point here. Sorry, go on ahead, Melanie, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, I just want to add some arguments here. It is about other workloads. Actually, when you migrate to containers and go to Kubernetes, actually, you're doing some sort of transformation of your real-life problem. So your applications can be, lift and shift to containers. It can be also up some sort of re-architect or even rebuild applications before going to Kubernetes. But when you actually enter the umbrella of Kubernetes, you actually change the problem because you benefit some natural advantage from Kubernetes, such as zero downtime, such as managing your way to manage scalability, availability, all sort of things. And you got also the whole ecosystem backup, to help you manage all those challenges, especially when you use, for example, working with service mesh, different, components in the ecosystem. Actually get some natural benefits from the ecosystem as well. So actually benefit really a huge community. You have a lot of contributors, backup. So that kind of help you manage your solutions. But from the enterprise perspective, they also need some people with enough skill sets to help you operate the solution, because Kubernetes, they have some natural knowledge, which is kind of different from you manage a PaaS service or you manage your application on-prem. Actually, it's kind of different. So you need people who has enough skill sets and specialize, in different sort of problem working with Kubernetes.
Okay, thanks, guys. Just in the studio here now, what I want to talk about is, so we talked about migrating to Kubernetes being easier, and it's been more of a challenge with PaaS. Arguably, taking an existing code base and porting it onto serverless can be very difficult, because you may be re-engineering something to be an event-driven architecture when it's not that. And, sometimes, migration is difficult because the code just doesn't fit, and you end up rewriting rather than reusing a lot of what's already there. Conversely, we've talked about migrations, but conversely, there is an argument that serverless is the easiest to build on green fields for. There's less of a learning curve with green fields, and there's some great tools that are available for nothing. Like right now, I can go into GitHub, I can go into a repository and open up a code space and start editing and writing code in a serverless development environment in my browser. Sorry, apologies to Martin Woodward, who's talking tomorrow, if I've just stolen your thunder. But yeah, there's some great tools for starting greenfields in serverless. Ritu, what would you like to say on starting afresh in serverless?
Starting a fresh serverless, I would say it's like a wish come true.
Yeah.
Because in our experience working with the businesses, when we recommend serverless, going serverless for existing applications, it's always an uphill task. There are issues of business continuity, which obviously we have to consider as tech people. So we have had issues when we have tried to migrate existing applications, one being the obvious one when the applications are not actually event-driven. Mm-hmm. So, and as such, the serverless environment is event-driven, and The architecture has to be changed. So many functionalities and the modules. Some of the modules you can just pick up and migrate right off, but most of them you have to rewrite and recode. So there's a learning curve involved there in first understanding the existing applications, so you can actually replicate it in serverless as well. So there's two-way learning curve there. But then if we look at the longer picture, the bigger picture in the longer run, the benefits, I would say, outperform the issues that we have in migrating the existing applications, and businesses should consider that bigger vision and longer term benefits over the short term issues that we face. As far as greenfield projects, oh, that's a wish come true, I would say. Because, then you don't have any backlog of existing applications which have to be migrated and so on. The first thing that is, but at the same time, I would say to be careful about not to jump onto serverless because you want to build a serverless application. Look at what you are trying to achieve from that application. What is the user base? What is a requirement in terms of scalability and availability? And if you need to maintain, how easy it is to maintain and scale, on a shorter term as well as on the longer term. Weigh out all the options, and once you have it clear, once you have decided on serverless, again, the next step would be deciding on the provider, because as of now we have different providers, and as we have seen in our experience when we are migrating from one provider to other, again, because businesses change direction and they suddenly decide they don't want to continue with a provider and migrate on to a new provider, it's as good as migrating a serverless to a serverless, a legacy application onto a serverless. It's as good as that.
There is something I want to ask you about that later, so
sure.
Park that for now. Glenn, so talking about doing greenfield development. So I was saying about how you may end up rewriting an application, but if you go from spending $300,000 a year down to 17, surely the rewrite effort's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the key things is at the start, once you've got over that initial learning curve, then the development can happen very, very quickly. It's just built, it's designed in such a way that so much of it's built in that what developers just, have a bit of fun throwing together over the course of a couple of weeks or even a few days, it'll still work, like it'll work at any kind of scale. Really, to echo what a lot of people were saying, I don't think any of these architecture solutions are a silver bullet to anything. Mm-hmm. In the case of that document generation system or any of the ones that I mentioned, serverless was a really, really good fit. And I think that's where the speed of development comes in. You can really quickly get stuck in, have something stood up. And if it doesn't work, you've failed fast, that doesn't work, and you can start shifting down that serverless spectrum, if you like, if that's the way your architecture is. And there are always going to be cases where, like I was saying, a beefy VM is the best solution, just because it's the older one doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be any worse in specific scenarios.
It's not only in terms of development, but also in terms of maintainability of that code. You are upgrading the system, there's downtime and, all sorts of issues that come with it. Sorry I was trying to use a word I shouldn't be.
I was, you made a point there earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. It was something you talked about in terms of vendor lock-in. Now, Kubernetes, one of the core strengths of Kubernetes is in its portability. So, for example, if I have deployed my application into a Kubernetes cluster in Amazon Web Services, and my company take a strategic decision that we're going to partner with Microsoft, Melanie, how easy is it to get my cluster out of AWS and deploy it into Azure? How would I go about doing that?
Well, that's a kind of a tricky question, actually. But from my point of view, everyone we work with containers, actually, we can see it's a really highly portable and easy to manage containers in different cloud providers. But I think Actually, this is exactly a technical problem, but more about a business problem. So I pretty agree, Raj said it previously in his presentation. It's because we manage a solution, it's in a pro providers. Also, it depends actually your contract with different cloud providers as well. And Kubernetes, I can't stress enough because it doesn't come along. We have the solution, Kubernetes is amazing. But also we can see they have a sort of integration with other services as well. So you manage all your solutions with EKS in AWS. So some sort of, they also work with like a Lambda functions or other AWS services. So when it comes to Azure, we can see this part of application actually is easy to migrate to AKS, and it can benefit also some really great feature like Azure Monitor, also other Azure services. So what we can see, the solution is not only from an application level, how to migrate a managed application, but it's more about a business level or from the point of view as integrated solutions for your whole strategy. So you go to Microsoft Cloud. So basically, we have a lot of ecosystem. We have some cloud native projects working with AKS. We also have different Azure services to back it up. So I think the whole thing we need to consider is really about your future strategy and where you're going in the future, and your other projects as well, because Kubernetes, for one specific application or a group of applications, it can be easy to migrate to other cloud. But in the future, you may, as your business growing, so you may have also other requirements for other projects as well. So for me, more importantly is you can see your current state, also your future state.
Yeah, okay. And so I think, Roger, you started the ball rolling on this, and Rita, you came in weighing in very heavily on it, is that whenever you say we're going with PaaS or you're going with serverless, you're really locking yourself into a specific vendor. So if you're in Azure, you're using their app services and their functions and their blob storage, or if you're with AWS, they're using their Lambdas and their S3 buckets and all their particular suite. But with vendor lock-in, a good company is averse to vendor lock-in for fear of any one vendor jacking up their prices. But right now, with all the companies offering such similar services and competing for the same developers, it's more, and the way I see it is more of a case of a race to the bottom right now. And question I want to answer is, because they're all competing to undercut each other, is vendor lock-in really something that we should be worried about right now? Glenn?
I think less so than maybe people think. Looking at serverless, for example, there are tools out there where. So my serverless tool set of choice would be CloudFormation templates, and it would have your infrastructure there as one big config file. There are tools on top of that where you can create an abstract or a generic config file. Serverless Framework's one of the examples. And that'll work in multiple cloud vendors. You would literally just change one property, which would be provider. And as you say, there's analogous products and services from each one. Yeah.
I want to quickly just get, Roger, what's your take on that from a PaaS perspective?
Sure. I think the thing also depends. It depends what you mean by PaaS. There are lots of different things that fit within PaaS. If you're talking about things like, Kubernetes, that's a relatively commodity PaaS platform. There are different provisions on different vendors. You can run NoSQL databases on many different providers. You can run those on a PaaS basis. I think it's more when you get into more of the specialist kind of platforms like the serverless and Dynamics 365, where you're exploiting some kind of specialist capability in that provider. That's where you tend to get more of the lock-in, as it were. So it needs to be an informed choice. You need to understand why you're doing it, why it matters. If you're upgrading from an on-prem to the cloud version of that same product, then that may be enough justification for doing it. So it's understanding why you're doing it as much as anything else. There is an element of lock-in, if nothing else, because trying to pull your data out and everything out becomes harder.
That's true.
You just need to understand why you're doing it, and I think they're still maturing. I think, you can share some of the programmatic technologies now between, Azure Functions now supports Java, for instance, and you can bring that into other serverless technologies as well. You just need to understand why you're building it, the way you're building it.
Very quickly, the last thing I wanted to talk about was just scale. I mean, Darrell, 40 million users for the NHS app. One of my favourite talks this year was given by Sheen Brizzles of Lego, who's watching at home. And his talk was on how Lego, their e-commerce application, a number of Black Fridays ago, collapsed under the weight of traffic. And that was their trigger to go fully serverless. And they spent the best part of the following year going completely serverless. And the following year, at Black Friday, their application stood up to all punishment, and they had their most profitable Black Friday ever. So there is a business case for scale. Now, some customers will say, this is all well and good, but we don't necessarily need it. And the question I wanted to ask was, does anybody think that in ignoring that possibility, you're gifting your opposition, your competitors with an open net? To me, I'm thinking about Nokia from 15 years ago, who decided we don't need this smartphone business because we're brilliant, and everybody knows how that worked out. You know, does anybody want to comment about missing out on business opportunities and scale? Rita.
I would say yes. I would totally go with serverless if you can, if you have the business case, and if you are worried about business continuity and managing and the longer picture on a longer term, then yes.
Okay.
This is the answer.
Anybody on call like to chime in with some words of wisdom on that?
So,
Darrell.
Yeah, sure. So I think it really does just come down to the business case. So the one that you've quoted there of sort of the Black Friday sale and markets, obviously. So that's a real easy example of picking out when an application needs to scale at a precise point in time. It just really depends on the business case. If you're in a business where you don't see spikes in traffic and you can map out what your load is more likely to be and patterns, or whether that's daily or monthly and times of sales and all that sort of stuff, then these are all things that need to fit into the technology that you build. So for me, it's really that the business application and the business needs feed into your technology decisions, and you're not just going out and spending massive investment building a system that massively auto scales really quickly whenever you don't have a business case for it to do so. So it's really one should feed the other rather than technology feeding that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's also about understanding why you're scaling, because most people think about scaling as being scale up. It can also be scale down. And it's the ability to adjust that scale for dev test as well as much as anything else. It's understanding why you're doing it.
Okay, folks, thank you all for your contributions today. Thank you all for your talks, and thank you for the